In this video, we're going to look at literal equation, which generally speaking, it's an equation with no numbers or with more than one variable, and we're going to be solving for a specified variable. We're also going to take a brief look at proportions. So literal equations is, we can also refer to it as rearranging. You might use it most often when you're rearranging formulas. Sometimes that's useful to us to either help us understand the relationships of variables and how changing one might affect another, or maybe that's the variable we're looking for, and we just want to have one formula to plug in instead of plugging in numbers and then trying to solve for that variable. But in terms of doing all the same steps we've been learning how to solve problems all still apply. So if we look at this example, r plus p divided by 3 equals s. So we're solving for p, so we identify the variable we're looking for. We're going to clear our fraction, multiply both sides by 3. We're going to end up with r plus p. And when you do this, if you have not as stellar handwriting such as myself, you need to make sure that you make your letters clear and crisp so you can tell the difference between what's a number and what's a letter. Sometimes you need to come up with your own code. Sometimes when I'm working on my own, I'll do the $ for S's so that I know that it's not a 5. So just keep that in mind. This is actually 3s. So we're solving for p, so now we use the subtraction property of equality and get p is equal to 3s minus r. There you go. We just solved that one for p. So let's look at two more. So this one, we're going to be solving for d. And in this one, we're going to be solving for r. So in solving for d here on the left, multiply both sides by 6. The multiplication property of equality. So we end up with 6a equaling b minus c plus d. We're solving for d, so everything else has to move. So we're going to use the subtractive property of equality, and I'm going to subtract b from both sides. Then I use the added property of equality and add c to both sides. There we go. 6a minus b plus c equals d. And for this one. Now, this particular equation is an actual equation. So in this one, we're looking at V equals IR. And this is an actual electricity equation where V is voltage, I is current, and R is resistance. So this is a specific relationship, and we want to solve for resistance. Let's say, for example, we know we are trying to solve for resistance, and we know V and I. So we can use the division property of equality and find out that V over I equals R. And looking at literal equations allow us to see things like, okay, voltage divided by current equals resistance. So looking at these two, we know if voltage or if current increases, resistance has to decrease to keep the same voltage, or vice versa. If resistance decreases, current increases to keep the same voltage. It's getting a little deeper than we need to for this class, but it's an application, and in my engineering courses, I actually used V equals IR quite a bit. The other thing we're going to look at is proportions. So proportions are a relation between two values. Usually it's a fraction. Um, it's Proportions are where we start to understand functions and rational expressions, so expressions with variables in the denominator. In When we tend to read proportions, we read it as usually see it written as A over B. Sometimes it's equal to C over D. Sometimes it's a colon like that. What what that is saying is A is to B as C is to D. So I think it might make more sense once we see it in action. So we have a machine that produces 225 bolts in 24 minutes. So we've got bolts in minutes. At the same rate, how many bolts would be produced in 40 minutes? So what we're saying as a proportion is we have 225 bolts in 24 minutes. So it's at the same rate. So this right here is a rate. So we can make a proportion. So at that same rate, X amount of bolts in 40 minutes. And then we can use our understanding of multiple multiplying and working with fractions to solve this. So 225 divided by 24 times 40, you get 375 bolts in 40 minutes. Look at another one without word problems. So this one says 11 is to x as 22 is to x plus 4. So we've got fractions. So our first step is going to be to clear fractions. So I'm going to use the property of equality, multiply both sides by x. So this ends up being 11, 22x over x plus 4. Be careful not to do this. Do not do that. That is bad. What you want to do is do the multiplicative property of equality again and multiply the whole thing by x plus 4. So we're going to end up with x plus 4 times 11 equals 22x. And we're going to use the distributive property. 11x plus 44 equals 22x. Since x is the variable we're looking for, we are then going to use the subtraction property of equality to get all of the x's on one side. We get 44 equaling 11x. And then division property of equality give us that x is equal to 4. So if we plug that back in, what we get is 11 is to 4 as 22 is to 8, which when we think about it, makes sense. And if you start, as you start to see the patterns with proportions, you could have jumped straight to this step. You could have said, okay, 11 to 22, what's the difference? Well, it's multiplied by 2. So what number when I add 4? So you're looking at x and then x plus 4. So what is x such that 2x is equal to x plus 4? We're going to take a look. So in this video, we looked at how to decode word problems, vocabulary, isolating math from a word problem, solving word problems. In this unit, you also looked at solving literal equations, so equations with with multiple variables, and we also looked at proportions. This takes us to the end of Unit 3. The quiz over Unit 3 will be linear equations pie slice in ALEX.